Near the end of the 90s, Capcom would release the final in their now iconic trilogy of Resident Evil games, with Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, firmly bringing survival horror directly into the mainstream, and capping off the final entry of that generation on a high. Resident Evil was now another on the long list of popular game franchises that Capcom owned. The final PS1 game, Nemesis, had the shortest development time, only a year. Now, despite the multiple original ideas it brings to the table, with Nemesis now becoming iconic to the franchise, it's arguably the weakest of the trilogy. Funny how history tends to repeat itself. Regardless, the trilogy is one of the strongest that the gaming landscape has to offer, each bringing their own flavour to what is basically the same concept, a zombie-filled survival horror game. One was a slow burn that took place in a fixed location, which gently raised the stakes as you continue to unlock more parts of the mansion, climaxing at the end. 2 opens and ends with a bang. It also took part in an infected city with a few varied locations throughout. 3 was fairly linear and was the most action oriented, but played out like a cat and mouse game between Jill and Nemesis. The trilogy was very much of its generation, and it was the hardware limitations that inspired a lot of Resident Evil's core design choices. The slow door opening cutscene that hid load times is the obvious one. The new generation, with less limitations, meant Resident Evil would spin off in many different directions, no longer constrained by PS1 hardware. 4 would reinvent the franchise into a campy over-the-shoulder shooter, while on the other hand Code Veronica, which might be the strangest game in the franchise, would try to capture the game design of the original trilogy, to lukewarm success. It then became a franchise of ups and downs, and struggled to find its identity for a while, until 7 went back to its roots. Resident Evil coming into the new generation seems to have regained its form. Now, this isn't a history lesson, and there's plenty of great retrospective videos on the franchise, so that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the remakes of the original trilogy. Most importantly, the clever decisions made with the remakes of 2 and 3 that capped off this generation. So clever in fact, you might not even notice it. But before that, we need to talk about the fantastic remake of Resident Evil 1 that originally came out for the GameCube. Most remakes offer nothing more than a graphical upgrade. Take Crash here as the prime example. These remakes tend to only justify their own existence, as the original counterpart is no longer playable on modern consoles. This remake bucks that trend. On a surface level, it doesn't seem that much different, except for a nice graphical upgrade that still holds up for the most part today. The game in essence plays identical to the first, tank controls, fixed camera angles and all. In retrospect, the analog control they've added to the ported versions such as the PS4, that allows the player to orient themselves backwards instantly, makes the game far too easy, but since it's optional to use, I'm not going to complain about it here. It's only when we look deeper does the remake begin to shine. It's not just better graphics. The art style and decor is stronger overall. This is not to say the original is bad. The use of colour helps immensely to make rooms and hallways stand out from each other. In the remake, the geometry remains untouched in most places, although due to the better lighting, the mood and atmosphere here is far more foreboding than the original. They've added some quality of life improvements, such as the quick turn and defensive weapons, the inclusion of new areas such as the graveyard and the new part in the woods. They've altered the layout of the mansion, adding new key items and routes, the introduction of Lisa Trevor, who will stalk the player at certain points throughout their playthrough. Now, zombie corpses will no longer disappear after they're down, unless they're decapitated from a critical hit, which introduces the new burning corpses mechanic. There is a limited amount of oil in the game, and the player will have the option to burn the zombie's body if you don't, the zombie will be revived later into a Crimson Head, a new enemy type that's a far more formidable foe. It deals more damage and is much faster than a typical zombie. In an effort to maintain a mystique about all the games I talk about here, just in case you haven't played them, I won't go any further. Suffice it to say, it's a great remake, due to the fact it's not just rehashing the original ideas again. Instead, the remake has whole new ideas of its own that work to enhance the overall experience. elevating the game beyond its predecessor. In fact, it's such a great remake, outdoing the original at its own game design, that I believe it eclipses it by a wide margin, which is a shame in a weird way, as the original arguably deserves more respect for creating the core design principles despite being an overall weaker game in comparison to the remake. I recommend you play both, as believe it or not, the remake is more enjoyable if you've played the original, thanks to how it plays with players' expectations. But if you only had to play one, I'd say it must be the remake. It's just that much better than the original. If you consume a lot of media, you know remakes tend to lie in the shadow of the original. The Resident Evil remake is that strange case where the reverse has happened, with the original merely being a footnote for the remake. As hard as it is to believe, Capcom felt comfortable making all those changes to the original, probably because they didn't feel that precious about the game. Sure, it's a classic to all of us, but to Capcom, the game that made them a household name in horror, leaves a lot to be desired. It has bad character models and fuzzy item textures, making them hard to find, not to mention the horrendous voice acting.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
To be fair, this is what makes the original endearing to the fans. However, to Capcom, they obviously saw a game that hadn't reached its full potential and wanted to right a wrong. Or, to put it another way, the core principle behind the 2003 remake was to overwrite the original, which is the very reason I made this video. Remakes tend to come in two forms. The first one is the easiest, a simple one-to-one remake. Crash and Shadow of the Colossus are here. The second is keeping the original core game design and mechanics while expanding and improving upon them. We can put the first Resi remake here. The problem with the latter is if that you're successful, you've created the definitive version, which in turn means you're slowly erasing the original from existence, as old games are becoming trickier to support on modern hardware. So why these remakes are both a good and a bad thing is a whole other video in and of itself, so I won't say any more. So to go back to the point I was originally trying to make, this was the catch-22 the remake team of 2 and 3 were in, as by all accounts, 2 and 3 are fundamentally sound games, with Resident Evil 2 being said to be one of the greatest games that Capcom has ever produced, and I tend to agree. This is why I have great respect for the 2 recent remakes of 2 and 3, despite me personally believing that they're overall weaker than the original PS1 versions, 3 especially. I'm not going to go into it here on why I believe that, as this video would never be over. I highly recommend you watch Critical Nobody's comparison of 2 Remake versus the original. Now, while I don't agree with everything he says, the video does give a good account of the nuances that the remake of 2 failed to capture. Link in the description.
In the original, both Claire and Leon would still fight various forms of William Birkin throughout their adventure, but each would fight different forms of him. If you cut between their encounters in either A-B pairing, you can see different stages of his transformation, kind of allowing you to track how far along his mutation is throughout the game.
3 on the other hand, while being enjoyable, it's the game's cut content, matched with its lack of ambition in certain areas, is what overall holds it back. Its failings are well documented on YouTube. In fact, you probably have a harder time trying to find a positive review. Nevertheless, the best thing about the 2 remakes in my opinion is instead of trying to eclipse the original like the remake of Resident Evil 1 did, or just create a one-to-one remake with a new coat of paint, like for example Bluepoint did with Shadow of the Colossus, or more recently Demon's Souls. Instead, these remakes essentially take the same concept, layout and design of the original 2 and 3, and they've created a whole new experience out of it. The games feel like alternate versions of the originals, rather than just a copy and paste remake. They seem to create their own versions of what is crucially the same game on paper. While playing the remakes of Crash, I felt like I was going through the motions. On the other hand, these remakes had me feeling like I was experiencing the game for the first time again. They achieved this because they're essentially different games. The remakes changes doesn't just add and take away parts from the original. They literally reconceptualize the entire experience from top to bottom. They achieved this by how they differ in game design, both in the gameplay and the subtler ways like the character design. Let's start with the gameplay. The core remains the same, resource management as you preserve ammo and supplies, while you search the area for key items and solve puzzles to progress. But that's really where the comparisons end. The major change to an over-the-shoulder camera similar to Resident Evil 4, this practically makes it a different game from that one change alone. Now with a crosshair to aim, the game's enemies and environments have been redesigned to incorporate that new system. It may seem subtle at first, but by playing both games back to back, it becomes obvious. Gone are the door transitions between rooms. Now enemies can bust down doors and travel between areas. An ability once limited to Nemesis. Enemy variety has been scaled back, and I don't think it's just due to budget constraints, although that probably accounts for some of it. More so, that certain enemies are less viable when targeting is much easier and faster. Because of the fixed camera angles of the original, getting a clear idea of what's ahead of you was difficult, and the jarring effect created when you snapped to certain angles in rapid succession, not to mention the slight delay between cuts. All this was tension creating, sure, but it meant enemies could easily get the drop on you, so in an effort for the game not to feel cheap, zombies were quite easy to run past, thanks to a very short grab range. Their slow reaction speed, paired with the spacious hallways, meant once you knew where the enemies are, they became trivial. Watch any speed run of the old PS1 games to know what I'm talking about. Combat came down to positioning yourself in the best camera angle in order to kill the enemy. This is why nearly all titles that have a fixed camera angle come with an auto-aim system to work in tandem with the camera. In the remakes, the new camera system means the reverse is true. Now that your vision is no longer obscured due to the camera, the environment and enemies have been reworked to match. Enemies might move at the same speed and take the same amount of bullets give or take in both the original and remake. Nevertheless, having no auto-aim and the much more cramped hallways, paired with the boost of speeds the zombies gain when you're in their grab range, means it's much harder to run past them. Also, zombies are much harder to floor, so it's more important than ever to immobilize them, making use of the new third-person aiming. This is great game design, to recognise and adjust the experience accordingly when such an essential change like the camera position is made. This shows how changing a simple thing, such as the camera, can have drastic changes on the experience. Another obvious example would be the changes to how Nemesis works in the original and the remake, with him now being limited to completely scripted segments. So if we continue this process throughout every aspect of the game, like the changes to the game's structure and layout, revised mechanics and the modifications to how certain weapons and items work, matched with the reworked bosses and alterations to the story, eventually the remake fundamentally becomes a different game from the original. Capcom, I believe, recognised this, and it's why I believe the characters have been changed to fit their new versions, rather than just be imitations of the original. Marvin from 2 here is the obvious example, as his role and personality is greatly expanded in the remake, but no more can this be seen clearly than with Jill in the remake, bearing little resemblance to her original design or her different variants. Sure, we can argue Chris in 7 looked nothing like his past versions either. Thankfully, they've rectified this with 8, which is a direct sequel. Therefore, it's clearly meant to be Chris from the previous games. Even still, in 7 his personality was no doubt the same from the previous games. Jill's personality is not unlike her 3 version, or for any version for that matter. Although in fairness, Jill never had much of a personality to begin with. Regardless, the point still stands. It's clearly not trying to replicate the original. When we tally all these changes in game and character design together, it essentially becomes a new game. So, what we end up with is Resident Evil 2 1998 and Resident Evil 2 2019. And the same for both versions of 3. This is why I believe both remakes don't have remake in the title, because the new ones are less of a remake and more of a reimagining of the same concept. Some may see this as a bad thing, be it from the fact they failed to achieve their goal by not properly remaking the game, although in truth, I believe it's overall a good thing. But remakes don't overwrite the original counterpart, like the remake of 1 did, or just essentially gives us the same again with modern graphics. Instead, we have both games with the original and the remake being able to stand apart from each other, but with their own strengths and weaknesses. So in a strange way, The remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 are some of the best, because they respected their original versions so much, they would dare try not to beat them at their own game. Remakes are considered good or bad by how they live up to the original. The Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake achieved something special by stepping themselves out of that comparison. Well, that's just my viewpoint anyway. For how much praise I give the remakes there, the paid for DLC for both games is outrageous. Once again, Critical Nobody goes into more detail, so please check out that video below.
Go about acquiring all of these unique duds? Well, that's easy. You give Capcom more money. $3 each.
If you're a long-time Resident Evil fan, I've hoped you learned something, and if not, I hope I've inspired you to try out one of the games. They're well worth your time. Most importantly, if you've made it this far into the video, I want to thank you for watching.